Hello, friends and neighbors, and welcome to the poem of the day for today, Saturday, October 25th, 2025. This is my third attempt, actually, on this video. I tried it 2 days ago, twice, and I had kind of an error loading or transcribing or buffering or something, and it got cut off once, and then the second time it just didn't transfer over. So, third time's a charm. Fingers crossed. Here we go. This video, unlike most, I'm going to suggest, almost insist that you go back and watch the previous one first, just because it's kind of in a series, or it's a one of two parts, kind of like when we did the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. If you weren't with us the entire time, it would have been a little jarring to jump in at, say, part 5. And so last video, I read The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. And because of the length of the poem, I said I would read it in its entirety on that episode, on that video. And that the next one, the one right now today, would be some commentary, reflections, analysis, etc. So overall, before I dive into some kind of close reading of the poem, I want to say that this is probably Poe's most famous poem. It is probably the one that is studied the most in middle school or in high school. And because, if you just heard that middle school or high school, there's a suggestion there that it is very teachable, it's very readable, but also that it's perhaps lacking some of the complexity or lacking some of the depth beyond merely surface adornment that one would expect out of a poem that's, say, taught junior year, senior year, or into college. You're not really going to go into a college class and read this poem, probably because it's not taken as seriously as a deep and intense work of art. And I think that is, with my own reading and understanding of it, pretty consistent. That's not to say that I don't like the poem, or that the poem's worthless, or that the poem's necessarily bad. I like it. I find it fun. And I admire the commitment to the structure and the style and the constraints that Poe puts on himself, even though that does kind of, as we've seen with some of his previous poems, he doesn't quite master that form. And so it leads to some places where there's some very awkward turns of phrase, which I hope to speak to a little bit later. Something else about this poem is just that it is so well known within the popular culture. I think there are a lot of people who have heard of it, or would be able to tell you that Poe wrote The Raven, even if they have not read it themselves. I think I mentioned previously that there's a Simpsons parody of it that's quite good. There's a video of Vincent Price performing it, kind of on a stage or a TV set, that also is very amusing and wonderful. So it exists within, it's kind of iconic in that sense. It exists within the collective cultural consciousness, even if a lot of people don't necessarily know it in detail. And so I think on that note, I'll just do a brief recap. It's a first-person narration. It's essentially a monologue. Even the quotes that we get from the Raven come filtered through the speaker. And the speaker, we can presume, is a middle-aged or late middle-aged, perhaps even early elderly, I think late middle age is probably most appropriate, man who is sitting in his chamber, right? Just sitting in his office or lounge living room. I'm imagining in a comfortable chair by the fire, maybe sipping a little whiskey or something like that, where there would be, a bunch of books. This is not specified in the poem. I don't even know if these existed, but I always imagine he has one of those globes that you turn back and then there's alcohol in it. Maybe a table with chess on it, something like that. In the Vincent Price one, he has this very lavish and ornate kind of bathrobe on. And it's late in the night. It's December. It's dark and it's cold, and he's reading. And he is thinking about his lost love who has died, named Lenore. When there's a knocking on the door, he goes to see what it is, and there's nothing there. And then a little bit later, a raven comes in through his window, perches on the bust of Pallas above his chamber door, and essentially drives the man mad, because the man is trying to think of the raven either as we kind of saw in Rime of the Ancient Mariner, either as a omen of something bad, foretelling death, which ravens typically have that connotation to them, or perhaps that it's coming from the netherworld to bring with it a message from his lost Lenore. And as he's screaming at this raven, the raven just kind of says back constantly, nevermore, nevermore, nevermore. And he tries to get rid of it, and then seemingly collapses near the end. I think he dies at the end, and we'll go to that in a little bit. So that's the narrative of the story, of the poem. And the poem, I did not count the stanzas, but multiple stanzas that all have the same structure to them and are all doing the same thing in terms of poetic and aesthetic devices. So I'm going to focus on just a couple of them to be emblematic of the rest. And if we look, for example, just at the first stanza, which I will reread right now. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this, and nothing more." So one of the distinct qualities of this poem is its sonic quality, that you can hear within it a rhythm, a cadence, a repetition, kind of a rephrasing or a parallel structure within it. And so to really focus in and hone in on some of those, each stanza is going to be 6 lines long, 5 lines that are consistent with one another, and then a last line that's kind of a half line. In this case, it's only this and nothing more. And those last half lines, that 6th half line, are going to rhyme with one another and are all going to have some variations on more or nevermore or Lenore, right? And it's not quite a refrain, because I think a refrain in the strictest sense is supposed to be the same phrase repeated. And this is not the same, but it's darned close, right? Nothing more, nameless here forevermore, nothing more, nothing more, nothing more, nothing more, nothing more, nevermore. And then once the raven arrives, it's really just variations on kind of quote the raven nevermore throughout. So it does turn into something closer to and more like a refrain in the second part of the poem. The first 5 lines of the stanza are in what's called trochaic octameter. So you might have heard of iambic pentameter, and you would know that that's 10 beats, penta being 5, and an iamb having 2, and an iamb being unstressed and then stressed, right? So 10 beats. Trochaic octameter means you're going to have 8 trochees, and a trochee is also 2 beats, so we have 16 syllables in a line, but a trochee is the inverse of a iamb. So instead of going unstressed, stressed, we're going to go stressed, unstressed. And there are 8 of those for 16 syllables. So you can hear that here, and I'm going to read with the intention of emphasizing the meter. Obviously, no one would read this way when they're reading the poem, but once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary. Okay, so you can hear it in there. Something else you might have heard is this internal rhyme. So dreary and weary, and dreary is going to be halfway through the line. There's often these caesuras within the lines that will mark the place where the middle of the rhyme is, the middle of the line is going to rhyme with the end of the line. We've talked about end rhyme before, meaning rhyming the last syllable of successive lines together. But if there's a rhyme within the same line, like dreary and weary, that's referred to as internal rhyme. We then get that again with, in the second stanza, in the third, where did I lose that stanza? Give me 1 second, please. Here we go. Unbroken, token, and then later spoken, right? So then right after that, you get kind of a third iteration of that rhyme. Also, you're hearing some repetitions. So as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door, and then the slight variation, tapping at my chamber door. So those lines 4 and 5 are both ending with the ing at my chamber door. And that's something that we're going to see throughout the poem with those line 4 and line 5. So the next stanza, sorrow for the lost Lenore, whom the angels name Lenore, entreating entrance at my chamber door, entreating entrance at my chamber door. Okay. And that's a distinctive quality of the poem as well. Something that I think a lot of people find annoying, but also something that maybe makes it more kind of easy to remember or perhaps sticks with you. One last thing I want to point out is the persistence of assonance, consonants, and alliteration. So if you looked at something like the third stanza, first line, and the silken, sad, uncertain rustling. So we start with silken, sad. So we're getting alliteration there, but then the S goes into the middle of uncertain and then rustling. So it kind of blends into a consonance there, which is the same consonant sound in the middle of words, whereas alliteration is strictly at the beginning of the words. And within that same line, purple curtain, that's assonance. That's the repeated vowel sound in the middle of words together. And there are other examples of this throughout the poem. That when this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, right? So that's one example. I'm just kind of randomly plucking lines at this point, but startled stillness. And then we get, where's another one here? Oh, that's actually an internal rhyme, so I'm not going to use that one as an example. But that goes throughout the poem, and then we also have a couple uses of anaphora. For example, in the last stanza, and his eyes have all the seeming, and the lamplight over him streaming, and my soul from out the shadow. Right, so beginning successive lines, successive verses with the same words or the same phrases is the creation of an anaphora. So I think one of the things, again, that's distinct about the poem is it's setting up this pretty strict structure for itself and adheres to that through what amounts to, when you recite it out loud, an 8 to 10 minute poem. And I do think that maintaining that and it's still telling a narrative through it is pretty impressive. And I think that's perhaps part of the staying power of this, not to mention just that it's kind of a ghost story. And the degree to which it's scary is kind of up for debate. In the Simpsons parody, I think it's Bart says, you know what would have been scarier than nothing? Anything. But what's neat about it is knowing the rest of Poe's work, opening that door and seeing that there's nothing there, but looking out into the pitch black night in midnight in the middle of December is to look completely into the abyss and to confront your own nothingness and to see, as Nietzsche says, if the abyss stares back at you. And so I think there is something of a terror there. And Poe writes later about things similar, about within the imp of the perverse, this desire to tend towards annihilation, right? That feeling you have of kind of, I'm afraid of heights, but then when I'm up on heights, I never actually think about jumping. I don't have any inclinations towards that, but there's a part of me, this little thing in there that's just kind of like, but what if, and I never would, but like, oh, but what if, some people talk about that with driving their car. And again, they would never do it because they don't want to hurt themselves. They don't want to hurt anyone else, but they just kind of think, what if I just kind of, drifted over a little bit in oncoming traffic? And then they're like, wait, where's that coming from? And Poe explores those things. So I did mention earlier, and then I'll start wrapping this up because we're coming up on 15 minutes, a couple places where the phrasing becomes awkward then. So fourth stanza, deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. So just something like that, dreaming dreams. What else do you dream, right? I guess you dream nightmares. Nightmares are a form of dreams. So that's one of those places where I think his really strict conformity to the form leads to something that's not only difficult to read, but also seems to be there kind of just to fill the ornate qualities that he's setting out within the poem. The hardest one for me, and I think it was hard for Vincent Price as well, who is a much better reader and a much better performer than I am. But if you watch him perform this, you can see him kind of, I think he practiced that one a lot, is in stanza 5. Soon I heard again a tapping somewhat louder than before. Surely, said I, surely there is something in my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Whoa. That's needlessly convoluted. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. when you're in the rhythm of reciting that stanza, which tends to have some sort of speed to it, I'm going to try to do that again and just let you hear how abrupt it is. So, back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning. Soon I heard again a tapping somewhat louder than before. Surely, said I, surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and at this mystery explore. I mean, that's just tough. That's a tough bit of line there. Last thing I want to say here, to try to redeem this poem a little bit, because I've been a little bit critical of it, is I think there's an interesting image at the end of the poem that kind of bookends the beginning of the poem, which is to say that at the beginning of the poem, in the second stanza, ah, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. I think that's a pretty nice turn of phrase there, that this person, the speaker, is remembering back to the bleakness of December there, and within the fire in his fireplace, there's kind of embers that are escaping, and then as they fall, they go out and then wrought their ghost upon the floor. Right when the ember goes out, you don't see it anymore, but presumably it still kind of falls and lays somewhere, and that he's referring to as its ghost, which also then kind of animates it. It suggests that there's a spiritual quality that's alive to these embers. We then go to the final stanza. And the raven never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. And real quickly, what I think is interesting here is at the beginning of the poem, there's an ah, distinctly I remember, as though I'm recalling this now to tell it to you, and that was so long ago. Oh, you know what? I remember that. And yet, within this stanza, we're hearing that the raven's still there, which seems like it wouldn't be something that you would have to be like, oh, I need to recall this real quick. Like that would be a big hang up for me if there was a bird that was still in there. However long later this was, presumably, again, it's at least 2 weeks later, because he's saying it's the middle of December. He doesn't say something like it was 2 weeks ago, it was earlier this month, right? By referring to it as December, I think that suggests that it's no longer December when he's telling the story. But on time here, and the lamplight or him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. So earlier we had the ghosts upon the floor. Now we have the shadow of the raven upon the floor, which again I think gives it kind of a demonic or a ghostly quality, suggesting maybe that the raven was never there to begin with. It was just a figment of the imagination of the speaker. However, and my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. Now I think that's really interesting, because we get recalling the shadow upon the floor, which brings us back to the embers and something that burns out and dies. And I think what happens at the end of this poem is that the man is driven into such a frenzy about this damned raven that he has some sort of shock, some sort of like heart attack or something. And then I think he dies and falls upon the floor like a dying ember, right? The light goes out and then his body casts its ghost upon the floor, where the shadow of the raven is, which kind of then suggests again that the raven is this harbinger of death, or this kind of grim reaper figure for him. And then it's floating on the floor, and it shall be lifted nevermore. So my soul's not going to be both lifted in the sense of uplifted to be to hear from Lenore again, but also that I've descended and I've died is how I'm reading that, which I think is interesting. And then it calls into question this whole, so where is the speaker? Where are they speaking from? To whom are they conveying this? If indeed the speaker is dead at this point, and why? I mean, I guess that makes the whole poem then the recalling of one's moment of death and torment, which is perhaps a little bit different than the traditional way it's read. I've gone on very long. You can see now why I wanted to split this into 2 days. I would have had over a 30-minute video, but if you're still with me, thank you so much for bearing with me and listening to my ramblings about this poem. I hope I hit on some of the things that make it memorable and liked by many, and recurrent during this season of spooky things, if indeed it's not the most terribly deep and substantive poem. I hope to be back again soon. We'll continue doing some Poe for the rest of the week leading into Halloween, and then we will shift gears after that. So thank you again for being with me, and may peace be with you.